Thank you. Over to you, Prof. Badayachi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tabang. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. Sorry about the delay. I'm just going to share my screen. Are you able to see my screen, Tabang?
Not yet.
Try again.
Yes, now it's visible. You can just put it on the presentation mode, please.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. As I said, thanks for spending the morning with us. So before we begin, I just want to say thank you to all the tutors for your invaluable role that you play in shaping the future of our interns. Your guidance and your mentorship not only equips them with practical skills, but also inspires them to grow into confident professionals. So we really do deeply appreciate your dedication and the time that you take in investing and in supporting their development. And to make your experience a little bit more fulfilling, South African Pharmacy Council is committed to providing the resources and the support that you need, whether through events such as this, as the Tutor Workshops, or any regular feedback that we could provide as assessors and moderators as well. Together, we hope we can create a nurturing environment that empowers these young minds while celebrating your contributions every step of the way. So we really appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy the presentation. Just to give you an overview of the outline of the presentation, so we're going to do a brief introduction. We'll look at which I've done, resources, what are the portfolio of evidence entries, what is the role of a tutor, some administrative information, and then we go into a deep dive into the CPD cycle, just as a refresher. So we want to know how you're feeling this morning, just to get a feel of where you are in terms of being a tutor. So just to describe your emotions. Natalie, do we have a poll for this? Are you going to display that on the chat?
No, we don't have any polls today.
We don't have.
Yeah. No polls, okay. All right, so if you could just comment on, I'm not sure, is there an opportunity to comment on the chat here on this platform, Natalie? Eh?
They can post in the Q&A section, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'd love to know how you feel. Are you feeling excited? Are you feeling overjoyed, frustrated? Whichever emotion you can describe you're feeling as a tutor, we'd love to know. So to kick off the presentation, just to give you a guide on the important resources that really help you through your process as a tutor. And the best resource that you could use is the Intern and Tutor Manual that is accessible on the South African Pharmacy Council webpage. If you go onto the platform, it's easily accessible under the Intern tab. So you go through the manual, and this particular slide comes straight from the manual, and these are the important resources from a legislative perspective, rules and guidelines, good manufacturing practice, standard treatment guidelines. These are all the resources that you potentially will use to guide your intern through the process for the year. So competence in the portfolio of evidence, now known as the POE, is really a precursor towards becoming a competent pharmacist. The POE encompasses the continuous professional development cyclical process, which is that four-step process that we're all familiar with. It is important for interns to fulfill the portfolio of evidence process because we want them to align to the 10-star pharmacist. And the 10-star pharmacist was developed, as you would know, by the World Health Organization. And the model really encompasses a large range of different aspects of what characteristics you need to have in order to ensure that you are the best pharmacist. So we thought we would give you an idea of all of the key characteristics. So looking at the pharmacist having the skills of being an entrepreneur, a team player, manager, researcher, leader, caregiver, communicator, decision maker, lifelong learner, and a teacher. So in order to achieve this and to become a 10-star pharmacist, you as the tutor, the role that you could play is to ensure competence in their practice, promote lifelong learning, develop the intern's professional skills, enhance the intern's career prospects, support their regulatory compliance and understanding, build their confidence, encourage ethical practice, and prepare them for future challenges. So what is the role of a tutor? The role of a tutor encompasses 3 key areas, as mentioned in the intern tutor manual, and it is the mentor role, being a coach and a role model. So from a mentor perspective, these are the core skills or key areas that you definitely do have as a tutor in order to support your intern through their year. So as a mentor, you're expected to motivate the intern, provide advice, ensure their success, give them direction, coach them, support them, give them goals that they can attain, and obviously provide some training through the process. As a coach, focus on skill building and problem solving, encouraging persistence and monitoring their progress, helping the intern achieve measurable outcomes. So this particular model was very interesting because it encompassed 3 key areas, which is the social, emotional aspect, the academic aspect, and the behavioral health and attendance. So it really is to highlight that as a coach, as a tutor, your role really doesn't stick or stay just around academics. It really is all encompassing, and just to remind you that interns do also need that social emotional support through the year. As a role model, to demonstrate professionalism, ethical practice, and integrity, inspire interns by setting an example, showing how to handle challenges and achieve goals. You play a vital role, as no intern is likely to succeed without a tutor who themselves are competent and knowledgeable, giving guidance, interactive, empathetic, and supportive. And just a reminder by Brad Henry, he said a quote which said, I quote, "A good teacher can inspire hope, ignite the imagination, and instill a love of learning," unquote. So what tutors need to be able to be responsible to educate and train new graduates? This comes straight out of the intern tutor manual. Provide the intern with equipment, materials, programs, and access to information systems and literature as needed. Providing guidance on the performance of day-to-day tasks and aid in the development of an independent, responsible decision maker on matters affecting the health of the public. The benefits of a tutor include supporting the future of the pharmacy profession, diversifying their skills, strengthening pharmacy practice, maintaining knowledge, and the potential for future recruitment of a newly qualified pharmacist. So essentially, the role as a tutor, you are expected to learn yourselves, to share your experience, to teach as well, to develop the interns to become future pharmacists, to assist them in being successful pharmacists, and really to become a true lifelong learner. Reasons why a pharmacist may not be registered or approved as a tutor, and again, it comes straight from the GPP and the intern tutor manual. So the first one is non-participation in CPD. So make sure that before you sign up to become a tutor that you are competent in the 6 CPDs that are compulsory for you as a pharmacist. Incomplete forms, perhaps, example for section F to be filled in by the Commissioner of Oath, sometimes that's missing. Non-payment of evaluation fees, erasure from the register, a pharmacist who only practices part-time in a pharmacy, and a pharmacist with a suspended sentence. So this particular slide is for the hospital complexes or public sector hospitals. And the reason we put it in here because of the nuances within the public sector. So just to highlight the key areas, interns may be allowed to rotate in a hospital complex because we are aware that within a hospital institutions, particularly tertiary institutions, there are multiple sites that exist within a hospital, so they are allowed to rotate. However, the conditions are there must be at least one approved tutor to be responsible for the effective practical training of the pharmacist intern concerned. The facilities or hospital pharmacies where the intern will be rotated must be approved and recorded by council, and each facility must have a pharmacist to supervise the intern. The facility or hospital pharmacy where such a rotation should take place for purposes of practical training, the period that such services would be provided, as well as the name of the pharmacist under whose supervision the intern would work, must be clearly indicated or described in the contract to be approved by council before the internship begins. The rotations must be for the purposes of practical training only. Community service pharmacists may be used to supervise training of intern where rotation takes place, and on the delegation of training by an approved tutor, so the tutor must be approved. An approved tutor, please note, may not delegate his supervisory responsibilities to a community service pharmacist. The legislative requirements, so no person may commence internship unless they are registered with the South African Pharmacy Council as a pharmacist intern. A contract has been entered into between the tutor and the prospective pharmacist intern at the pharmacy or institution registered as a provider of a qualification in pharmacy, at which the internship will take place. The tutor and the practical training premises have been approved by the South African Pharmacy Council. So just a reminder on the anticipated tutor training course, a board notice was released last year, and this was for the implementation of the standards for tutor training programs. And if you want further information, you can go to board notice 318 of 2022. Essentially, this program is for those pharmacists wishing to register as a tutor to supervise interns. The purpose of the qualification really is to prepare and equip the pharmacist to be eligible to serve as a tutor with the knowledge and the skills required to fulfill the role of a tutor. So currently we don't have any providers, but hopefully in the near future we should see some. The forms that are required during internship, and I'm sure your interns are aware of this and you are aware, so just a reminder of some of the forms that you need, that you may look for, and all of these forms are accessible on the South African Pharmacy Council website, such as the application of session of contract of internship, declaration of completion of the 400 hours if your intern is an academic institution, progress reports, and then application for registration as a pharmacist with a qualification in pharmacy obtained within the Republic based on the Pharmacy Act. Pre-registration evaluation components for interns. So we wanted to give you a summary of what are the expectations for the intern to successfully complete the successfully complete the year as an intern. So they need to be successful in the pre-reg examination, successful in 6 portfolio of evidence entries, completed 365 practical training days, and the tutor must have submitted all of the required progress reports which are favorable. So essentially, these are the core components for the year. In terms of the portfolio of evidence requirements for the intern, this is really, the interns are familiar with what the expectations are, and it's just a refresher for you as well, because I'm sure you're familiar with what the expectations are in terms of the 6 domains that they need to cover. So remember, we have 6 domains within the manual as described. You'll see it's quite detailed in the manual. Just remember that your interns must always have the intern manual accessible to them. And it really is a comprehensive document that provides all the information that they require. From experience, I find that interns don't read the document. Almost as a guessing exercise, they wing it. So ideally, please, if you could get them to read through the manual and become familiar with where to find information. It really is a great tool that provides everything that they need. And you can become familiar with it as well. So there are 6 domains. Within these domains, we have competency standards, and there are competency standards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 that they need to complete. They can choose any competency standards from within these domains, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Competency Standard 5.3, which is the ethical and legal practice one, is a compulsory one. So every intern has to fulfill that particular competency standard and all of the behavioral statements, providing 75% provided that 75% of the behaviors associated with the competency standard and 75% of evidence that is provided to support those behaviors, they become competent. Note that competency standard 6.3 is only recommended for academic interns, but we'll get through the challenging ones and the compulsory ones later. A fee of 316 Rand is charged on submission of the 10th and subsequent portfolio of evidence entries. So just a note. And just to highlight the dates for the portfolio of entry submission deadlines in the table on your right. And this is also accessible on the manual, in the manual. So qualifying for the pre-reg exam, submission of the portfolio of evidence entries to qualify for admission into the pre-reg exams. Please take note that the POE submission dates for the exam purposes are on the right. You can see the table on the right. The interns are encouraged to ensure that they submit their portfolio of evidence entries and succeed in them within the normal POE submission cycle in order to be deemed eligible to write the exam. Avoid submitting these entries after the normal submission deadline, as this will attract a late booking fee for the pre-reg exam. So just take a note of the timelines. Just advise to get your intern to submit these entries way before the deadline in order for you to have the opportunity to review them adequately and provide feedback if there's any changes that are needed. The progress reports and their timelines. You can see on the left table, these are the timeframes that are also found in the manual. So the first report in 12 weeks, second 24, third report 36 weeks, and the fourth report in 45 weeks. And then just to make a note in terms of the academic, manufacturing, and wholesale interns who need to finish their 400 practical training hours in a community or institutional pharmacy, they need to fulfill that requirement, and I'm sure you know what the requirement is there in terms of finding a suitable site for them, or they need to find that for themselves. So just before I continue, I know just to highlight that it's really a lot of information that we're providing this morning, and just to make a note that we're not expecting you to be assessors. We're really here to help guide you through the process. And remember, these PowerPoint slides will be available to you online, and it's really going to be hopefully a useful tool for you. So just going back as a refresher, the portfolio of evidence for pharmacist interns is based on the 2018 competency standards for pharmacists in South Africa. You can refer to the manual for more information. And what they do describe is what a newly qualified pharmacist must be capable of at entry level within their practice to meet the scope of the needs of patients in South Africa. And as I mentioned earlier, it contains 6 domains with various competencies and behavioral statements. So we'll go into the depth of what each of this means in terms of the domains and competency standards and the CPD cycle. Just want to take a moment. Stefan, can I go ahead? Is Prof here?
Please continue, Vinny. Thank you. Can you hear me?
So, yes, I can. Go ahead. So the continuous professional development cycle, if you've been part of the intern workshops, you'll be familiar with these slides. It's really just a refresher on what we give to the interns, and we wanted to just help guide you through the process and purely to remind you what are the expectations and how the assessors and the moderators review this. So to remind you, the CPD is a cyclical activity. The definition is a process by which registered persons maintain and enhance their competence through their professional careers, encompasses a range of activities, including continuing education and supplementary training. It enables registered persons to develop in their area of practice and to demonstrate competence. So the three key areas that you need to remember when you're looking at a CPD cycle or you're looking at the intern manual, not cycles, so when you're looking at the intern manual, the three areas that you will notice is the domain, the competency standard, and the behavioral statement. So the domain is the overall description of what is within that particular competency standard. It describes what it means, what it entails, which areas will be covered. And then the competency standard becomes more in-depth, and the behavioral statement allows the intern to provide more detail on demonstrating how they are competent in that particular competency standard and that domain. So we have 6 very distinct domains. Public health is the first one, safe and rational use of medicines and medical devices. Number 3, supply of medicines and medical devices. 4 is organizational and management skills. 5 is professional and personal practice, which is the compulsory one, which is ethics. And 6 is education, critical analysis, and research. So the domains are organized clusters of competencies. So the competency standard, as I said, is part of a domain. The intern needs to find out, so how does this particular domain apply to them in terms of their daily practice? What activity that they do really aligns to that particular domain? So there's an introduction to the domain, which gives a very distinct, clear description of what the expectations are for that domain. So please ensure that your intern reads through that. The competency standards, they range in number through each of the domains. Behavioral statements, so those are the A, B, C, etc. And then you have the description of entry-level, intermediate practice, advanced practice, and then the assessment tick box. So each of the competency standards are structured this way, and the intern will be focusing on the entry level. So an example of a competency framework is 5.3, and we chose this particular one purely because it is a compulsory one. And sometimes we're finding interns not competent on their first try. I don't have statistics, but from my experience with moderating, we're still having a challenge with ethical and legal practice. The behavioral statements there are A, B, C, D, E. So they need to fulfill 75% of those behavioral statements. So this is an example of a typical domain. So domain 5, which is professional and personal practice, which describes what the domain is. Then it has a does this standard apply to me block, which says the standard applies to all pharmacists who are required to deliver pharmaceutical services in a professional, legal, and ethical manner. The introduction describes what it's about. So it is the professional and personal practice domain and includes behavioral statements that relate to the practice of pharmacy in a professional, legal, and ethical manner to deliver patient-centered pharmaceutical services in a multidisciplinary setting. Capability and outcomes. A person who has achieved this domain is capable of delivering pharmaceutical services in a professional and legal, ethical manner. And then it describes 5.3, which is the compulsory one, as I mentioned earlier. So if you look at it, it says A, B, C, D, E, which are the behavioral statements. And if we look at each one, so A is applying the Pharmacy Act, the Medicines Related and Related Substances Act, number 101 of 1965, and any other applicable legislation in daily practice. B is practicing within the scope of practice of a pharmacist, recognizing their own limitations of personal competency and expertise. C is keeping abreast of legislation and applying relevant amendments accordingly. D, complying with professional indemnity requirements. And E, practicing and adhering to the obligations of a pharmacist in terms of the principles of the statutory code of conduct for pharmacists. So if you look at it quickly, you are able to establish that it's based on a lot of legislation. The expectation is we want to be able to see, does the intern understand where to find the Pharmacy Act? What is the Pharmacy Act all about? What is the legislation? How does it apply to them in terms of a professional and a personal practice, an ethical and legal way as well? Code of conduct, they need to refer to the code of conduct as evidence. professional indemnity. So we expect them to show us evidence of a professional indemnity and their scope of practice as well. They need to understand how are they limited in terms of their scope of practice, or what is the difference if they have to provide a case study of a pharmacist assistant, for example. And then C is keeping abreast of legislation. So what we've been finding recently is interns tend to use the old scope of practice. And as we know, there has been a new regulation that has now changed and the scope of practice has been amended. So we want to see that they are keeping abreast and they're aware of the changes that are occurring within their profession. So we put this slide in just to remind you in terms of quality. We tend to find that the quality of submissions are not ideal. We would like them to improve. And just to remind you that in the intern manual, intern and tutor manual, it clearly states that if the tutor is not pleased with the authenticity of the evidence and the quality of the intern's entry, he or she may, after discussing with the intern, return the affected POE entry to the intern to make necessary corrections and submit it again for verification. So quality is really been a problem in terms of what we've been seeing as pieces of evidence and the way interns have been providing their evidence to ensure that they're competent. So we've been having trouble, and we thought perhaps let's just give you a guide or a checklist on how you can ensure that the interns are providing quality evidence. So the first thing to look for is relevance. So are the activities aligned with the intern's role and goals? Appraisal, is there evidence of relevant knowledge and skill acquired? Outcomes, are the outcomes specific, measurable, and linked to the professional improvement, to their professional improvement? And completeness, does the submission follow the required format and addresses all the required sections? So the reason why we're going through the in-depth CPD training, as we would for an intern, is to make you understand what we look for and for you to have a look that quickly browse through to be able to ensure that the intern is actually fulfilling these requirements that we need as assessors and moderators. So how do you do this? You can gain an in-depth understanding of the POE process for the interns, as I've mentioned earlier, but also this workshop will help guide you. Provide constructive feedback, request evidence and check for confidentiality, calculation errors, legislation relevance, plagiarism, falsified evidence as well. So those are key areas that we're finding challenges with in terms of submissions. So we find calculation errors are common. For example, with the compounding submission, we find when an intern submits a calculation for the compounding exercise, the calculation sometimes is incorrect. So we would like you to assist in making sure, I mean, that's the purpose of the tutor, is to ensure that there's no errors, and that's your role, to guide them and to train them to get these areas correct. It's okay to get them wrong, but we want to be able to see that they have been corrected. Legislation relevance, so looking at the evidence that is current in terms of the most recent information, publications or changes that has occurred in regulations. Suggest areas of further learning. Provide post-submission support, so discussing feedback, encouraging self-assessment, and promoting iteration. And then maintaining quality assurance, so comparing submissions, having a look at potentially somebody else who's has passed. If you have 2 interns, if you're lucky enough to do that, you can, within a pharmacy, you're able to compare with another intern. Perhaps you can do a peer review exercise and get another pharmacist to have a look and doing audits regularly. The key thing, I mean, as I said earlier, it's really a lot of information, and we don't want you to lose the essence of your role. We really want you to have fun while you do the tutoring process and make the learning continuous with the intern and not regimented. So as much as possible, get everybody to have fun and try to have fun yourself as well. Just refreshing again on the requirements. So I'm sure you're familiar with it. You need 6 entries from the domains where 5.3 is compulsory. So everybody has to provide evidence on that. From each domain, 1 competency standard must be chosen. So read all of the behavioral statements very carefully. So make sure that your intern is very aware of what the expectations are for a particular competency standard. If the competency standard has just 3 behavioral statements, the evidence is needed for all 3 statements. So we expect 100% evidence for competency standards that just have 1 to 3 behavioral statements. If there are 4 more behavioral statements, they need to provide evidence for at least 75% of that competency standard, and they need to fulfill 75% of those behavioral statements. So make sure that the intern understands that, because that's another challenge that we face as assessors and moderators, that they're not complying to the 75% rule. It becomes difficult, and we'll go through the example just now, but just to highlight the importance, if they don't submit, if they provide 75 or show evidence of 75% attending to the behavioral statements and the evidence that relate to those behavioral statements, then they're most likely not to be found competent. So all of the information is available in the intern manual. It's done really nicely. As I said, it's really a great resource. So please have a look at it. Each entry, as I said, must be accompanied by suitable evidence. Every portfolio of evidence entry must reflect the intern's individual work, and no group activities are acceptable. And we'll get to that a little bit later in terms of the group activities. So this is the cycle that I'm sure you are all familiar with. So it's the first step is reflection, planning, implementation, and evaluation. And you have the experience of going through this with your own CPD, so you're aware. So we're going to go through each part of the cycle. So the first one is reflection. So if you remember, if you look at the intern manual, or even if you remember from your own submissions, you need to have an appropriate learning title. So the learning title really needs to be descriptive, but it needs to be succinct. So it must encompass what the intern is looking to do in that particular competency standard. It's very important that obviously it has to be relevant to what they want to learn. So what is the trigger for choosing this particular competency standard? Why do they choose it? And that must come through in their learning title and the learning need as well. So don't just, if you see them copying straight from the competency standard, that will give them an immediate 0 for that component. So please just, if you could just check that they are giving a very descriptive title, but keeping it simple at the same time. The learning title must be unique and describe their case study. So in the reflection component, what is the expectation from the intern? What can you do? And what are some of the practical steps? So if we look at the intern manual, if you have access to it, there's a fantastic table. I can't remember which page it is on, but it gives you a guide as to how the assessors and moderators evaluate the CPDs. So step 1 is reflection, and we give the mark range, and then the criteria that the expectation is. So we follow this as our guide when we mark the interns. So if you look at the learning title, it says in order to achieve 1, the title has to be original, descriptive, and related to the competency standard. And then if you look at the learning need part, which is part of the reflection component, in order to achieve 3, there must be a clear learning need according to the competency standard and associated behavioral statements, and there must be a trigger scenario provided. So what happened that the trigger triggered the learning need, and indication of what the intern hopes to achieve after completing the competency standard. So those are the 3 key areas that we look for when we are marking or assessing and moderating the reflection component. If the intern is missing a component of it, for example, often what I find from my personal experience is that they fail to indicate what they hope to achieve after completing the exercise. So then that would mean they would be partially comply, for example. So what can you do as a tutor? Firstly, you check, is it their own learning need? Remember, the description of this must be I. What reflective prompts can you provide to help interns to think more critically? How can you create a safe space for them to have an open discussion with you about their own growth and what their learning needs are, what their trigger scenario was, and what the expectations are from this particular exercise? Are you yourself modeling good reflective practices? And are you actively assisting the intern to identify relevant learning needs? So some of the practical steps that we thought you could use is asking open-ended questions to deepen the learner's reflections, using examples from your own CPD journey to inspire learners, and encouraging a growth mindset by focusing on progress and future potential. So this checklist is also available in the intern tutor manual. And we use this as our guide, as I said. The checklist includes, is there a title, yes or no? So we want the interns to use this, and this was developed a few years ago to help the intern. Because as I said, it's really the list that we use in order to mark the assessments and to deem the intern competent or not. So the reflection, you can see, has the intern stated clearly what they need to learn? Has the intern stated his or her learning need in the first person? I need to learn. Has the intern stated why he or she has identified this learning need for his or herself and not just stated that it is a required outcome? And has the intern made sure not to include details of planning and implementation here, so not to mix up the different sections? If they follow that grid that I showed you on the previous table, it really is a stepwise process, which has really been described really nicely in the manual, which would allow them to become competent easily. In the planning section, so the planning section is the resource component. The challenge that we face here with the planning section, often with interns, is the detail. So they don't provide us with sufficient detail as to which resources are relevant that they're going to be using for this competency standard, whichever that they have chosen. And they don't give us the details of the page numbers and chapters, and they fail to link whatever resource they're using to a particular behavioral statement. So what we expect from the intern here is, how exactly are you going to learn this? So what are the resources in order to achieve a public health campaign? For example, what resources are you going to use? Are you going to use the World Health Organization as a reference? Which guideline are you going to use? Are you going to use the standard treatment guidelines, and which page and chapter are you going to refer to? So those are the things we want to be able to see, and then linking it specifically to the behavioral statement that is found in the manual. So what are their options? Make sure that they link it to the behavioral statements and structure the planning accordingly. Mention the relevant current resources to be used with specific details. Describe the reason for using the resource. So why are they using this resource? They can't just stick in a resource hoping that the assessor or the moderator will see the relevance. They need to tell us that they understand why they're using that particular resource. That is the purpose of doing the CPD, so we can understand their reasoning towards achieving a particular outcome. So what evidence can I submit, or can they submit, to support their learning activity? And planning is always written in the future tense, I will do. So on the right, there's a table that describes, and this comes again straight from the manual, this is the grid that we use. And in order to achieve a full 3 that is fully competent, we expect them to have a detailed plan, which is provided in a future tense, the reasoning as to why they're using their resource, and specific details, and linking it to the 75% of the behavioral statements. So it's really simple. If they do those steps very distinctly and it's clear to everybody that they have achieved that, then it becomes easier for us to assess and moderate. Remember, don't only get them to describe how they planned to proceed, but say to them, ask them, what are you going to do? How are you going to do? Why are you going to do these things? So the description behind the reasoning as to why they chose that resource and how they're going to do that particular activity is really important in the planning section. Again, this is the checklist that we use. It really was prepared for the intern as a guide, and that's accessible to them in the manual. So in the planning section, we thought, just to give you an idea, it is a busy slide, but to help you potentially how you could assist them in the planning, because sometimes interns get stuck as to which resource would be the most relevant for this particular competency standards. We thought we'd just give you some guiding tools. So for example, they could use a particular reflective tool like a self-assessment questionnaire or a skills gap analysis to say, firstly, to identify that this competency standard is what they need to achieve because of their lack of knowledge in a specific area, or even potentially to assist them in a particular exercise. Like if they're doing public health campaign, they could use a questionnaire for the public, and you can assist them on these types of tools. And these are easily found online as well. You can suggest how they can achieve their goals through the famous SMART goals, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Example, instead of saying improving communication skills, you could say complete a course on patient counseling that could be found online, for example, or watching a YouTube video. However, reading a particular counseling textbook, and I'm sure we all have access to that in our pharmacies. Training plans, so maybe perhaps to assist your intern through the year, you could develop a training plan and put it into their calendar, a specific training plan, which includes maybe workshops, case studies, however you deem fit within your pharmacy and the capacity that you have within your pharmacy. Maybe perhaps even get the intern to do it for themselves and to get approval from you so they have a more specific plan or training plan for the year. And then implement that particular training by providing instructions and giving them a helping hand through it. Checking on their progress, reflecting and adjusting. So giving them some feedback on how they can potentially refine their plan and assist them in achieving that goal for that competency standard. So implementation is the next step in the CPD cycle, which as I said, you're familiar with. So describing what the intern did here. So here the expectation is now that you've planned, you've reflected, you've planned, now you've actually implemented what you have planned. So we want to see what was done, when it was done, where it was done, and how it was done. The important part here, and often that's missing in this section, is the linking to the evidence and linking to all of the behavioral statements that they have chosen, the 75% of the behavioral statements. We're saying 75%. If the intern wants to go 100%, it really is up to them. They can decide on that. But ideally, in order to find them competent, we need 75% competency evidence and behavioral statements to be linked. It must be written in the past tense because they've done this exercise already. So if you look at the grid again at the bottom, the first component is the achievement date. So you can read through that. That's really just timelines. Description is in order to achieve 75, in order to achieve 3, the description of what, when, where, and how is what we look for as the assessor and moderator. It must be linked to the evidence to support what they're saying and linked to how this aligns to the behavioral statements. And then in terms of the evidence, Adele will give you more detail on the validity, authenticity, currency, and sufficiency of the evidence. Again, each evidence obviously has to be valid and current and appropriate for that particular behavioral statement. It must be annotated and must be linked to those behavioral statements, and Adele will give you more detail on that just now. And this is the tick box that can align to the implementation. The last step of the CPD cycle is the evaluation. So from my experience, evaluation is not ideally done by the interns. And the reason being they forget to identify further learning needs, and that's sometimes a glaring gap. It is getting better over the years, but I find that anecdotal evidence, really not proven by me, but from my the sample that I moderate, I find that most of the interns fail to comply with that component. So they don't necessarily get the full 3 fully competent, they get partially competent in this area. And the focus here really is, now that they've completed the exercise, to really just evaluate what they've done. So the learning outcome here is, what has the intern learned? So what have you learned? And how is this related to the evidence that you've provided? Application, how is the knowledge being subsequently used? So in their practice on a daily basis, or wherever, however through the year that or the past few months that they've experienced, how have they applied what they've learned in this competency standard in their job? And what has been the impact? How has this newly acquired knowledge changed their practice? And because the expectation is that because it's based on the learning need or the trigger that happened at the beginning of the reflection process, we want them to tie it in with the impact. So now that they have this new knowledge, how has it changed the way they practice now? And then lastly, identifying future learning needs and not what the intern does or did, purely just to tell us what is the future things that they're looking to in order to improve themselves on. And then in order to be deemed with the full 3, they need to have what was learned in terms of the competency standard, how the learning influenced his or her practice, an application by means of practical and actual examples, and identifying a future learning needs. The examples must be specific here. Okay, and that's the checklist. Again, it's reiterating what I've said. It's describing exactly what we request or look for when we're assessing and moderating. So I'm going to hand over to Adele. Thanks, Adele. She'll take over from here.
Thank you, Veni. Good morning, colleagues. I just want to confirm with Council Taban, do you want to take a 5-minute break now, or are we continuing?
Hi, Adele. I think we can take it now, just 5 minutes. So the time is 10:10. If we can be back at 10:15. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. See you 10:15. Welcome back, colleagues. I hope you enjoyed the quick body break. Thank you, Vinnie, for your presentation. And I would like to continue with the evidence part of this presentation. And for some of our tutors which are seasoned, I hope you find some valuable information. And for the tutors that are new, I hope this provides some insight into how we assess the intern CPDs or the intern portfolio of evidence and what we are looking for. So the evidence is very important, and from an assessment perspective, we find that interns struggle with the evidence and to properly annotate and to make sure that it adheres to all the criteria that we have for evidence. So there are 5 that should be adhered to, and it should be annotated, it should be current, it should be valid, authentic, and sufficient. So with the annotation of the evidence, and this is where a lot of interns struggle with their submissions, they provide the evidence. For example, if we think about the evaluation of a prescription, they provide Regulation 33, and on the next page, they provide the prescription, but they never link the two to each other. So they don't show us how they evaluated the prescription, and that can only be done through proper annotation of evidence. So what the intern should do with the evidence is they should give meaning to every document that they have included in their evidence. They should show us why it's there and to which behavioral statement this piece of evidence is linking to show that they have gained a skill. So it should provide a justification why the evidence is there. It must be planned and meaningful, and every piece of evidence must be linked to the behavioral statements. So it should show us what they have done, and it shows us an action or a behavior. So if we look at the annotation, just the example, it is in the intern presentation as well. What a meaningful annotation and an annotation with no meaning. And as you can see, a lot of interns will tell us this is the date or this is the expiry date, but they won't tell us the importance of that. So for example, for the prescription, we know a prescription is valid for 30 days, and the intern should identify that as part of the identification of the date. So the next slide, we just provided an example of a submission just for you to have a look at it and to see if you can identify what is missing on this evaluation or this submission. So first of all, we're going to look at the reflection, and this was done for 5.3. And there you can see the intern said on the 1st of October, I was assigned to the storeroom where we provide medication to the wards, including Schedule 6, which is highly addictive. So that was the trigger scenario for this. And this requires the wards to be closely monitored with strict professional oversight on their distribution. So there we have what happened to the intern. So we know the context of this submission. The next thing, I aim to learn the practical aspects of receiving stock, documentation, and managing these highly scheduled drugs in the pharmacy. So there we have a learning need. And then the last aspect that we need to have is what the intern hopes to achieve after addressing his learning need. And where interns struggle with this is, for example, if you look at this, what they hope to achieve for 5.3 would also include being able to practice in an ethical and legal environment. But what the interns do is, for example, they say they only want to know more about Schedule 6 medication. So they always have to go back to the competency standard and make sure that everything is aligned, and it's not only about the topic or the learning need of somebody else, but what the intern hopes to achieve when he completes or he or she completes this activity. So we have 3 things there: the trigger, the learning need, and what the intern hopes to achieve. So you remember, if you think back to the checklist, all these items are in the checklist. If you want to be allocated a 3 to be competent, these are the aspects that should be included. And we see that interns really struggle with this. So if you can maybe just provide some guidance on the writing of these sections. So the planning, as Vinnie mentioned, it should be in the future tense, what they will be doing and which resources they will be looking at. And if you remember back to the checklist, what is required there is we want the resource, the section within the resource why they chose this resource. And the last thing that you can see is missing from this planning section is linking to the behavioral statements. So we want to see for every behavioral statement which resources or what the intern is going to do, or is the intern going to consult the tutor, or what the case may be. So the planning, you can see, is in future tense. I will observe and consult the pharmacist for handling these medication. During this time, I will learn how to correctly record it. I will request permission from the pharmacist to perform the tasks under supervision. Throughout this, I will adhere to the Pharmacy Act, the Medicines Act. So you can see the resources mentioned in this section, but the intern can go further and he will say Chapter 5 of the Pharmacy Act. You can see GPP section 1.4 and the scope of practice of the intern. So we want a little bit more context. We want the resource, the section in the resource, and it should link to the behavioral statements and the reasoning for the planning. So the implementation, as Vinnie mentioned, what we want to see here is when this happened, what happened, where it happened, and how it happened. So the implementation is a very important part, but this only has meaning if it is linked to the evidence and to the behavioral statements. So you can see that the intern provided a description, but there's no linking to show how it's relevant to the evidence or to which evidence it is addressing, but we can see the when, the what, the where. But if you look at the bottom, missing is the reference to the evidence and the behavioral statement. So what we would have been looking at this, for example, is I ordered Schedule 6 from the depot with a purchase order on the RX solution system. And then in brackets, we would like to see something like behavioral statement C or behavioral statement A, so that we can just see which piece of evidence is linking to which behavioral statement, or they can have a reference evidence A, behavioral statement 5.3C, for example, so that the implementation also tells the complete story with a link to the evidence. We've provided an example of some evidence with some good annotation, and this is a problem for some of the interns, just to give meaning to the evidence, to tell the story for the whole activity, and to give some clarity about what the intern did. And there you can see some good annotation. For example, on the left-hand side, I reviewed the Medicines and Related Substances Act. On page 14, where I learned as a pharmacist intern, I may handle this particular schedule, and it's linked to a behavioral statement. On the invoice side, you can see I checked the address of the invoice to ensure that the medication delivered was for the correct pharmacy, and it was for our pharmacy. So there you can see at the top, the evidence is linked to behavioral statement A and B with clear annotation, what the intern did, how the intern did this, and exactly what was checked, it was signed, who the signatures belong to, and you can clearly see the good annotation on this piece of evidence. The next page, I know this slide is full. You can see for on the top left-hand side, there's behavioral statement A, and after conducting proper inspection of the medication, I asked the pharmacist to unlock the Schedule 6 cupboard, as it's always locked, and she's in possession of the key, and that is then just linked to the GPP, and which sections, and then again, the behavioral statement. At the bottom, you can see the Schedule 6 register where the entry was made into the register. Very important, interns sometimes include a Schedule 6 register, and then they protect their own patient's confidentiality, but they leave everything else open depending on what is written in the Schedule 6 register. Just make them aware of that. There you can see all the annotations. This is the name and the form, all the information that's needed there, and it gives some guidance and relevance why it's included, and it's very easy to follow this evidence and to see exactly what the intern did and what they are trying to prove. On the left-hand side or the right-hand side, we have a certificate of insurance, professional indemnity insurance. That's also very important for 5.3. It's one of the behavioral statements. And just a note for the intern, just remind them to check the expiry date, because sometimes they still include the student professional indemnity, or they forget to renew it, or they go over their period and it has expired. So please just remind them of that. So there you can see keeping abreast in the middle. It links to behavioral statement C, and the intern describes why this piece of evidence is there, because sometimes we get a lot of scanned pages without any annotation or providing relevance or context of this document and why it was included into the submission. Example of evaluation, there you can see, you remember there are 4 aspects that should be included there as well. What was learned, how it influenced the practice, and you can see what's missing from this if you read this section is an example of practical application and identification of a future learning need. You can read this section quickly, and where interns also struggle with the example is they have to give us an example of how they applied the skill that they have learned. So for example, the intern will do a presentation on diabetes, for example, and then their future learning need will be they want to do the same thing, but for another, for example, for HIV. But that was not the learning need. The learning need was how to do training, or how to do from patient education or patient counseling. So they must link their application to the competency standard and not the topic they have selected. So if we get to the requirements for evidence, I know you are aware of this, but just for the new tutors, it has to be current. So it has to be collected during the internship period. We sometimes do see that interns submit posters and research they completed as undergraduate students. So please make sure that they do it while they are registered as interns, so that's for current. It should be valid. So it must pertain to a specific competency standard. We see that interns sometimes struggle to identify evidence, and then they include everything. And they say they will consult the Pharmacy Act, the Medicines Act, the conditions of employment, and that may not even be relevant to what they are trying to prove in this CPD or portfolio of evidence. Please assist the interns with the factual information and calculations, because if there is a calculation error or factual information that's factually incorrect, they will automatically be not successful when they submit this entry for assessment. So you can see if the evidence is not valid, the other 4 criteria will not count. So you can see, for example, if this is about how to make sushi, and the evidence is about the source that we are serving with the sushi, it will have no value for the assessment. Authentic, very important, the intern should do their own work. The tutor will verify online that the intern did the work themselves, and the tutor, please make sure that you verify the entries. And very important, we all know interns submit latest. They send you a SMS late in the evening and say, I've submitted. And in the next presentation, you will see with the new verification or the plagiarism software, the intern will have to have a additional schedule for themselves to make it possible for you as a tutor to do the verification in time or on time. And they should just be aware of that. It should be sufficient, and Vinny has also spoken about that, the number of behavioral statements and the number of pieces of evidence or the behavioral statement that they should address. So if there are 4 or more behavioral statements, we are looking for 75%, at least 3 behavioral statements should be addressed. If there are 3 and less, we are looking for all of the behavioral statements. And interns sometimes struggle with this as well. They select a competency standard where they cannot provide evidence for all the behavioral statements, and then they do a theoretical exercise for one of the behavioral statements, and they haven't actually done that because they are not able to collect the evidence for that. And then we would suggest that they select another competency standard where they actually will be able to collect the evidence. We also ask interns not to submit entire legislative documents, for example, not the whole Pharmacy Act or the whole Medicines Act, just the sections that's applicable to their submission and just enough to show what they are actually wanting to prove or what they want to show the assessor, how they learned what they are doing at this stage. So make sure they have enough evidence, and the interns should focus on the quality of the evidence and not the quantity, because you can use one piece of evidence for more than one behavioral statement as long as it's within the same submission. The evidence, please assist your interns. They are struggling. They are submitting photographs where a photograph doesn't necessarily prove that you have gained the necessary skill. Make sure that if they take photographs that they identify themselves on the photograph and they remember to maintain patient confidentiality. If they're using official references, the SAMF or the GPP or what the case may be, they must include the reference name, the edition and the page number that they used. Otherwise, we don't know why they included it or where they got the information from. Delivery notes, for example, and this is also in the intern presentation, so they should know this, why they've included the delivery note, who signed for it, and then everything that is annotated on these documents show us why it's included, link it to a behavioral statement, identify yourself, and just why it is there. It is a challenge for interns to come up with good examples of evidence to show competence. And maybe if you can guide your interns in selecting good evidence or thinking a little bit out of the box to find evidence that actually shows that they have acquired a skill. So what we say for the interns is just put yourself in the assessor's shoes or ask somebody else to have a look at this photograph. What does this prove? Does it prove what I'm trying to say? And do I need to include another piece of evidence, or is this sufficient? So evidence, no glossy photographs. Please not upload it upside down. Just ask the interns to look at that. And especially for patient confidentiality, I assessed the CPD yesterday. Some interns are using whiteboard markers and they fade when they are scanned into PDF, and then patient confidentiality is not protected anymore. Please, the evidence should be in one document, and the annotation is, as you can now see, is very important to provide some context, some guidance for the assessor, and just to show us why the intern has included everything. So what kind of evidence? We've spoken in detail to interns about this. So if they provide information to a patient, they can include the prescription, or there can be a assessment form, or you as the tutor that witnessed it, or somebody that witnessed the interaction can maybe verify. If they are talking to a group of people, what can they attach there? Maybe attendance register with the name, the presenter, the date, the venue, the reference material they used, the feedback they received, the handouts they made. Anything can be added to that as evidence. That will be good. But if the intern can think of anything, we get very creative submissions. But maybe just guide your intern what would be good evidence to submit with their submissions. So if you're consulting a patient, they can include the patient history, request form, blue copies. With blue copies, just remind the interns there are patient information on the top, in the middle, and at the bottom, to protect patient confidentiality everywhere. On product labels as well. Sometimes we see in the compounding, they protect patient confidentiality everywhere, but not on the final product. So there's a few examples of what they can use. If they're consulting a prescriber, they can include the reason, the reference material, if they had to make a suggestion to the prescriber or what the scenario was, the telephone number, the date of call, and maybe somebody that witnessed the conversation or that was present while the intern was speaking to the prescriber. Please make sure that the interns use scientific information and not Wikipedia or chat. And it must be annotated. And again, please stress the importance of linking the evidence to the behavioral statements. So if they attend a meeting, please make sure that they have a contribution in the meeting, they have minutes of the meeting, they have an attendance register and an agenda, and why it was relevant to what they want to prove. Just attending a meeting and you have no contribution doesn't prove that you have gained a skill. For academic interns, if they are working with data or any other intern that's doing some research, we can include a proposal or the screening report or the data analysis. There's a lot of evidence that will be applicable there that they can include. They can include how they did an experiment or questionnaires they sent out in the pharmacy or what the case may be. There's a lot of evidence they can include for this one. As Vinnie mentioned, the checklist is available in the intern manual, so the intern can use the checklist, check their progress, make sure that they've included everything. And when we do the feedback workshops, we sometimes get the idea that interns haven't used the checklists and they didn't use the criteria that was specified to them. So maybe they can hand this in with the submission for you just to verify that they have actually done this. But if they use the checklist, I'm sure that they will be competent in their CPD submissions. So for the evidence, it should prove what they did, what was done. It's not really reading an article. It's not a theoretical scenario, and it's not witnessing someone. The intern should actually do the activity and show that they've gained a skill. And please, some of the interns, we have very good submissions, but some of the submissions can do with some improvement. So maybe just guide some of the interns. So we all know the stepwise approach for the CPD. So you will only be involved online for the verification process once you receive the message from council. You can check it before or you can check online. You will verify and please assist the interns. We get a lot of messages, the interns that they don't understand or they don't have some feedback or they don't have clarity. So if possible, please assist your intern with the report and reading the report and making the changes that is required. We find a lot of resubmissions where nothing has been changed. The intern just submits the same entry because we can see the previous entry that was made, the previous reflection, the planning, and all the sections that was done in the system. And we see a lot of submissions where the intern just submits exactly the same thing without making any changes. Interns know they should first do the annual declaration, and you are just involved in the verification, and the deadlines, as Vinnie showed you, is in the intern manual. So the assessment, Vinnie also spoke about that, and you've seen the criteria. So we work on the 1 to 3 scale. The criteria is in the manual, and all the phases and all the criteria that should be adhered to, you have seen. And just stress to the interns the spelling and the grammatical errors, the punctuation and the capitalization of the trade names. And they should just remember there's no autocorrect on Pharmacy Council's website, but I'm sure all of you know this from our own CPDs that we are doing. So you know about the 0, the 1, the 2, and the 3. So you can just stress that with the interns. So it's really possible if they just use the checklist, they can easily meet the requirements and be competent in their CPD submissions. So you can see, check the manual, So feedback from the assessors, there will be a report. A few interns don't print the report and they just go back to the tutor. So just remind them to bring you the report if they need some guidance. There will be comments that's dated. Even if the intern is successful, there might be a report that has some guidance for next submission, so that the intern should just have a look at that. If they were not successful, there might be some specific pointers about what was wrong, and it will usually be based on the criteria in the checklist. So the intern can just have a look. Didn't they link to the behavioral statements? It wasn't in future tense. There were no future learning need, or what the case may be. But the assessor will provide some guidance of what was missing based on the checklist, because that is what we are using for the assessment. And then just remember the feedback session that will be later in the year. Just remind your interns to attend that if they are not successful in their CPDs. So for resubmissions, if the intern is not successful, there will be a waiting submission showing on their profile, and they will need to resubmit. So please remind your intern to read the report, and if the assessor suggested that they should do a new submission, that they do a new one. If it suggested they should change something, that they do that, and see each resubmission as a standalone activity or a new submission. So the assessor or the moderator will give them some guidance on what to do with this. Sometimes the activity happened a long time ago, so the intern had a public health campaign in January and they only submitted in July, and then there will be no possibility of correcting that submission, so they will have to redo that activity. But just look at the comments, the intern will have some guidance there. For the resubmissions, remind the interns to submit early and regularly so that they will be able to write the exam, they will be able to be placed for community service, and you will be able to take a new intern early in the new year. So common errors we see on resubmission from our side, they are not following the comments, they are not addressing any of the comments, they're making no changes for resubmission, they are just submitting the same activity again. They are retrospectively falsifying evidence, and that was just what I was speaking about now. An intern submitted a public health campaign that they did in January. They submitted in July, and then the assessor or moderator will make some comments, and then suddenly they will have an attendance register. They will have feedback, which they didn't have previously. So just make sure when they fix something that they actually do have the evidence for that. Or if they had it, just add it. It's easy to fix patient confidentiality. If the only issue with the submission was the patient confidentiality that was breached, they can just fix that and just resubmit the entry. Another issue we are having, not checking all the phases of the cycle. So there's no storyline. They are not using the checklist to make sure that they've included everything that needs to be included in the phases of the CPD. Again, with resubmissions, so to prevent further submissions, stress the intern they need to follow the comments and make the changes. The portfolio of evidence is sent to the same assessor. Sometimes interns tell us that they hope somebody else will assess that and they will be successful, but it will go to the same assessor and the comments will be checked, and then they will see if the changes were made. And Vinnie also spoke about the levy. So please assist the intern so that they can stay within the 9, ideally just 6 submissions. Without any resubmissions if they use the checklist and take some time with their CPDs. The last thing is the professionalism. Tabang and we'll be talking about that, the new plagiarism report that has been added for submissions for this year. The entries must include their own work. We as assessors and moderators, we find some interesting submissions, and if there is something, it will be given to council for them to investigate further and then decide what will what will be done about these submissions. And then just maybe guide the interns just to, they find the internship year difficult. The CPDs, they have to get this done and they have to write the exam. And it's not just another hurdle for them, and they can use this to develop their skill and maybe address some learning needs they have before they write the pre-registration exam. The last thing I want to talk about is confidentiality, and we've spoken about that in the Schedule 6 register as well. Interns like using scribbles, and we can identify patients in the scribbles, as you can see, or they use whiteboard markers, which fade when you convert them from PDF. They should please check everywhere, the trailer labels, the Schedule 6 register, the blue copies are in more than one place if they do compounding the final product. If patient confidentiality is breached, the submission is automatically not successful. And patient confidentiality does not apply to doctors, hospitals, and other facilities. Staff where staff training is done to staff members. But if they have to blank out personal information, just advise them not to block out everything so that there's nothing to assess. You have to see, okay, about 20 people were present, see a part of the signature, maybe just the first part of the name, that they just carefully block out everything, but not to blank out everything, then there's nothing to assess. So thank you, colleagues. Vinnie, I think this is your slide to continue.
Yes, thank you, Adele. Let me just share. Can you see my slides, Adele?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adele. That was awesome. So the next few slides really is just to assist in making a decision on which is the most suitable competency standards for a particular domain that we over the years have gathered information as assessors and moderators, and we found those that were the most challenging and the most difficult, and some of them that were recommended and possible as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with it. It's really just a resource for you to be able to go back to and assist your intern. Okay, so if you look at domain 1 and 2, the most common one we see that is recommended and is most successful most of the time is 1.1, which is the public health one. Easy to fulfill, easy to execute in terms of a retail pharmacy or hospital institution. So we find that interns do pretty well in that one, except for certain nuances that they may have trouble with. But generally speaking, they do well in that one, and we recommend that one. So you can see the challenging is 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. Not to say that it can't be done, but it becomes challenging to obtain the relevant evidence to align to the behavioral statements, and therefore becomes a struggle for the intern. And then 1.6 is looking at, for example, glucose monitoring, blood pressure, etc. That's generally easy to do. In domain 2, recommended is 2.1, 2.2, and 2.6. Generally speaking, interns choose 2.2, 2.1. It's easy to achieve evidence accessible within the pharmacy in terms of what the requirements are, supply chain, procurement, etc. In domain 3, the dispensing domain, here most interns do 3.4 successfully. And also 3.5 as well, which is the compounding one. Just remember with the compounding one, because it's just one behavioral statement, the intern should not be fooled that it's the most easiest one to do, even though it looks like it's easy because it's just one behavioral statement. But the expectations are that it has to be in depth in terms of all the relevant resources that apply to compounding, extemporaneous compounding. So we look for details such as expiry date, batch numbers, details of how the compounding has happened, the batch manufacturing records, standard operating procedures, good manufacturing practice, standard operating procedures, all of those things are pieces of evidence that we look for in order to align to that behavioral statement and ensure that the intern understands the process of compounding. In domain 4, 4.6 is the most common one. We find interns choose that's the application of policies and standard operating procedures. It's again just 2 behavioral statements. The problem that we find here often is that interns submit the good pharmacy practice as a policy. So good pharmacy practice is not seen as a policy, rather we recommend to them, and you'll see in the later slides, like national drug policy or any policy that within their institution that they may come across. For example, something as simple as pest control is a policy, health and safety is a policy. So those are some of the examples, and there all we want them to do is to show us how they're actually applying a particular policy and an SOP. So evidence of not just submitting the SOP, but actually showing us how they've implemented and learned from that particular SOP. Domain 5 I spoke about, which is compulsory, the ethical practice one. Domain 6 is the training one. So training, the challenging one here is the one that's recommended 6.2, but what happens with 6.2 is the training plan is often where the biggest mistake happens, where the intern doesn't know what a training plan is, what a training plan looks like, or it doesn't provide us with an example of a training plan. So we struggle with finding the intern competent because if I'm not mistaken, I think it's 3 behavioral statements there. So they have to provide evidence for all 3 behavioral statements. And if they don't, then they tend to fail that particular domain and competency standard. So the evidence that's related, so we've given you a guide to the evidence as well. So in your own time, you can go through, but just to give you an idea, for example, 1.1, which is the recommended competency standard that we suggest. Some of the evidences that you could suggest to your intern is, for example, an attendance register, show how they've actually presented the poster by promoting health pamphlets, perhaps, that they could have used a PowerPoint presentation as well. Don't forget the attendance register. Make sure that the confidentiality has not been breached as well. So that's a common one. 2.1, 2.2, you can have a look. Counseling plan, for example, patient feedback for 2.2, the tutor statement, how they're dealing with sensitive issues, for example. So the rest of the slides here just goes through some of the evidence that we suggest and we've come across that aligns to the behavioral statements. So when you have some time, you can interrogate them and get a better understanding over what types of evidence that we look for. But as I said, it's not restricted to these types of evidence. It really is up to you if it aligns. If you think the intern is aligning it to the behavioral statement, then and you can prove that it shows competence in that behavioral statement, then we're happy to accept that. Same with 5 and 6. So 5, just make sure that all of the acts are provided. Make sure that it's the relevant act. What we find sometimes is they don't quote the most recent legislation. They're using very old documents. So for example, we've seen recently with the scope of practice, as I said, we can't mark them competent if they're not aware that the scope of practice has changed and have been updated recently, and that's accessible to them on the Pharmacy Council website. So keeping abreast would not be deemed as competent because they're not showing evidence of that. So that's an example of that. So make sure that it's current when it comes to the evidence. And then 6, I said, training plan is a problem. So make sure that they're aware and provide suitable evidence of a training plan. So we're coming to the end of the presentation, and we had discussions with some of the tutors in other provinces and in Gauteng and Limpopo province. And one of the slides that we found interesting from a Limpopo tutor's perspective, and these slides come from Mr. T.S. Rasakela in Limpopo, from Limpopo. And it was interesting to see some of the challenges that he highlighted from his experience as a tutor in that province. So he said, from an intern perspective, what he found in terms of the core competent development is the lack of planning by interns, the inability for them to see things throughout the year by having a very clear plan as to how they're going to achieve these 6 domains. Non-independent thinking, lack of independent learning ability, so they constantly need assistance, lack of comprehension and analysis capability, and insufficient preparation. So the inability to plan ahead and difficulty in thinking independently seems to be standing out under the core competence. Other challenges in terms of skills he picked out was communication, adaptability, creativity, teamwork, transparency, and time management. And then lastly, in terms of their attitude, a sense of a lack of enthusiasm and initiative, no sense of responsibility, lack of passion, generally unhappy, low morale, and mental issues on the rise. So as tutors, I think you may already be aware of some of these challenges that you face personally within your environment, or maybe you'll see them through this year. And we would like you to guide your intern appropriately, help them if you see them struggling, just provide some support, because your role essentially is to mentor and coach, if you remember from the beginning of the presentation. It's not easy, but as we said, we're also here to support you if you need any guidance at all. In terms of the tutor challenges that he pointed out was a lack of teaching plans, assessment versus compliance submission, limited time allocated for the verification of the CPDs. There's a non-standardized approach to the CPDs, limited tutor support, no defined support system, and a disconnect between learning content and the practical work. So as I mentioned earlier, we really appreciate your role as a tutor, and it is a huge task, and we understand we've all been tutors as assessors and moderators. So we understand how frustrating and sometimes demotivating it can be. But by highlighting these challenges, maybe you could be proactive in assisting your intern and yourself in achieving the goals much easier through the year by having a more systematic approach to the CPDs now that you're aware of what the expectations are from an assessor and a moderator point of view. It is challenging. I know your workload is intense, particularly in retail and hospital settings, but perhaps having the intern have a plan for the year would make the process a little bit more streamlined in achieving everybody's goals. So some of the process challenges that he also mentioned in his presentation was systems downtime. So when we have challenges online, for example, and the system's not working, delinking of tutor and intern profiles, renewals of training, accreditation, so the administrative aspect of it delaying the process, exclusion of the tutor on the feedback process. So that came out quite strongly in his presentation of how the tutors would like to have more feedback from the assessors and moderators, and perhaps we can discuss that in the future, how you would like to see the comments, for example, and we would like you to speak to the interns and perhaps get them to show you what the comments are for now. No access of learner marks by the tutor, only the outcomes, and then section view of the CPD reviewed on different screens limit the flow of the document. So that's really the way it's viewed online, and that seems to be a challenge for the tutors as well. So finally, the tutor verification process. Just remember to evaluate the entire portfolio of evidence entry as we've described to you in the workshop thus far, all the expectations, the various steps in the cycle, what our expectations are, etc. Key areas, and just to ensure quality throughout the process. Just make sure that your interns are not submitting substandard work, because it just delays the entire process and holds the intern back towards the next step into community service. Make sure all elements of authentication are present, and very important, verify online upon completion by the intern. You can accept and release to South African Pharmacy Council, suggest how to improve their entries, and just make a note of plagiarism and confidentiality. So remember also, please refrain from giving the intern your passwords to access onto the website and allowing them to just authenticate the process. That really defeats the process of being a tutor. We need you to ensure quality, and you really are quality assurance just before we assess and moderate those CPDs. So if you could just refrain from giving that, I'm not saying that you do, but we have had cases where tutors have done that. So just ensure quality, always interact and guide the intern to see how they can improve their entry, and remember your role as a mentor, coach, and role model. Here's some interesting stats before we conclude. So 2023-2024 outcome statistics, we found that in 2023, interestingly, 31% of the entries were not successful. So interns not successful in all 6 entries. And then there was a vast improvement in 2024, where we saw 20% only of the interns were not successful. So what we would like to see is no orange blocks within this graph in 2025. Hopefully we eliminate that unsuccessful interns, and that would be a wonderful achievement now that the tutors are more part of the process and aware of what the expectations are of the assessors and the moderators. Thank you so much, Tabang. You're up next.
Thank you, Vinny. Okay, are you able to see my slides?
Not yet,
Yes, we
Tabang.
can see them.
Oh,
Can
no,
you
it's
put them in
coming.
presentation mode, please?
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. So this is the last part of our workshop, and we will be looking at plagiarism detection system for intern portfolio of evidence entries. So this is a new development that we are implementing this year in 2025. And maybe I should mention that previously we had few unprofessional conducts that were reported by our assessors and moderators, wherein interns were found to be copying from the portfolio of evidence of previous interns. So as a council, we had to come up with a measure to control that or to correct that behavior. So that's why we are now talking about this plagiarism detection system, which is going to be implemented with effect from 2025. So what is happening with this system is that when the interns are submitting their portfolio of evidence, they will be expected to submit for plagiarism detection before they submit for tutor verification. And then when they submit, the system will then check for similarity between the portfolio of evidence entry submitted by the intern with those of that were submitted by the previous intern. So we will be using our existing database of all the portfolio of evidence that were submitted before and for the current interns as well. So once that is done, then there will be a report that will be generated for the intern to view, and then the intern can be able to submit for tutor verification if they are happy with the report. And then tutors, here their role is that the system will allow them a view-only access to the report, meaning they won't be able to modify the report in any way. So they will be able to see it. And then what we want the tutors, maybe what I want to share with the tutors now is just the process of submission of the portfolio of evidence so that they can see where the changes are, and then they can also see where they're fitting in the whole picture. So this is like a process that will be followed, and it will start with the intern. So the intern will follow the normal 4-step CPD cycle, wherein they will do the reflection, the planning, the implementation, and the evaluation. So when they are on the last step, which is the evaluation step, the system will now instruct them to save and submit for similarity check. Remember, previously, after the evaluation step, they will save and submit for tutor verification. So that has been changed. They will have to submit for similarity check first, and then as part of the similarity check, they will be expected also to accept the Turnitin EULA, because we are using the Turnitin system to do the similarity check. And then they need to agree to the EULA for them to be able to continue with the process of getting their entry being checked for similarity. In case they don't agree with the EULA, then they won't be able to go to the next step. So after agreeing to the EULA, then the entry will be submitted for similarity check, and then it will take some time, and then the report will also be generated once the check is completed. And then the intern will then be able to view the report and see the results of the similarity. So from the office, the maximum acceptable similarity score is 20%, meaning anything above 20 we consider it to be high. So in that case, the interns are expected to go back and review their entry for plagiarism and amend the entry for resubmission, and then they can then be able to follow the same step until the similarity score is within the acceptable percentage. So at this time, the tutor won't be able to see the entry, but once the intern is happy with the score, they can now accept the report. And then once they have accepted the report, is then that they will submit for verification by the tutor. So the tutor will be able to view the report as well as the entry that the intern has submitted. They will be able to do the comments on the entry as they used to before, and then the report is just for you to view and be able to advise the intern where needed. But unfortunately, you won't have any rights to make any changes to the report. And then once the tutor is happy with the submission, then they can submit for assessment. So this is the process in short. Unfortunately, I don't have the screenshots to show you exactly what you will see, but that will be uploaded on our website probably next week, and then you'll be able to follow what is it that is happening with this new system. So remember, it's going to be implemented from maybe probably next week, because we wanted to make you aware of the changes first. Now that you are aware, even the interns were informed during the workshop yesterday. Sometime next week, we're going to implement it, and then any submission from next week will have to be subjected to the plagiarism detection prior to submission for tutor verification. So that's what I can share with you at this stage, and thank you so much. I think this is bringing us to the end of our workshop. Our colleagues will share the link where you will do the survey. Please make sure that you complete it, because we're going to use it also as a proof of attendance. And then at this stage, we go into to the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabang. At this point, we have not received any questions yet. If anyone has any questions, they can either comment on the YouTube feed or post them in the Q&A section on Teams. The attendance register has been shared in the Q&A section.
Maybe while we're waiting for the questions, maybe I should mention that we are going to have another workshop on the 20th of February. So the workshop will take place in the evening. So we thought maybe we should have one during the day and one in the evening, just to allow tutors who are too busy during the day to have a chance to attend in the evening. So if you want to be part of the workshop again, please feel free to join. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Seemingly, we are not receiving any questions. This doesn't mean in case you have one after the workshop, we're closing you out. Please feel free to contact the office. We will still be able to assist you. And at this stage, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the tutors who managed to join us today. We really hope the information that we shared with you will assist in helping the interns to be competent in the portfolio of evidence early in the year so that they don't experience challenges when they are due for release. We thank you, and thanks to the team from